November 23, 1942, 9:47 a.m., 22,000 feet above the Tunisian desert. A German pilot slams his throttle to the firewall. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 screams forward at 390 miles per hour. Supercharger howling. Engine vibrating through the airframe into his bones. He is running, not from bombers, not from flak, from a single American fighter that has been glued to his 6 o'clock for the last 4 minutes. He rolls hard left, pulls negative G, dives for the desert floor. The American stays with him. He pulls vertical trading speed for altitude in a desperate climbing spiral. The American climbs with him. At 28,000 feet, where no Allied fighter has ever followed him before, he looks over his shoulder and sees it. Twin tail booms, 2 spinning propellers. Nose guns pointed directly at his aircraft. He has never seen anything like it in 3 years of war. His hands begin to shake. If you're here for the deep cuts of military history, the untold moments where one machine changed everything, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You're in the right place. In the next 45 minutes, you are going to discover how a twin-engine American fighter that military experts called suicidal to build and impossible to fly in combat became the single most feared aircraft in the Luftwaffe's worst nightmares. A machine that destroyed over 50 German transport planes in under 30 minutes. That forced the most experienced fighter pilots on Earth to rewrite their combat doctrine from scratch. That helped trap and surrender 250,000 Axis soldiers in Tunisia. And it all started because one unconventional engineer looked at an impossible set of requirements and said the one thing everyone around him considered absolutely insane. He said, "I can do this." With 2 engines and no fuselage. But before we get there, you need to understand exactly how dominant the Germans were. Because without understanding the mountain, you cannot understand the miracle of climbing it. By late 1942, the Luftwaffe had been fighting for 3 years straight. Poland, France, Britain, North Africa, the Mediterranean. Everywhere they went, they won. Their pilots flew with a confidence so deep it had calcified into something dangerous certainty. They were certain they were better. Certain their aircraft were superior. Certain that whatever the Americans brought to this fight would be cut to pieces, just like the British Hurricanes and the French Dewoitines had been cut to pieces before them. And honestly, up to that point, they had good reason to feel that way. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was a masterpiece of German engineering. The 1942 variants, particularly the F and G models, were the product of continuous refinement, stretching back to 1937. Powered by the Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, the 109G produced 1,475 horsepower and could reach 398 miles per hour at altitude. Its mechanically driven supercharger was optimized for combat between 15,000 and 20,000 feet, exactly the altitude where most air battles happened. It carried a 20mm cannon, firing directly through the propeller hub, and 2 13mm machine guns above the engine cowling. At under 7,000 pounds fully loaded, it was light, fast, and responsive in ways that heavier fighters simply could not match. German fighter doctrine was equally refined. Their pilots flew in pairs called Rotten. 2 pairs formed a Schwarm, a loose 4-plane formation that gave each pilot freedom of movement while maintaining mutual support. They climbed high. They dove fast. They fired short bursts and climbed away before the enemy could react. They did not dogfight. They executed execution orders from positions of advantage and left before the situation could turn against them. This doctrine worked because the 109 was almost always faster in the dive, better in the climb, and more agile than anything the Allies could field in 1942. The Spitfire could match it in a turning fight, but had barely enough range to cross the English Channel and back. The American P-40 Warhawk was slower at every altitude and could not climb with it at all. The Bell P-39 Airacobra had catastrophic high-altitude performance because engineers had placed the engine behind the pilot and forgotten to give it a proper supercharger. German pilots in North Africa had learned to simply climb above the Americans. Get to 23,000 feet. Look down. Pick a target. Dive. Fire. Climb. Repeat. The Americans below had no answer. They tried aggressive formations. They tried altitude changes. They tried different attack angles. The 109s still came screaming down through their formations, and by the time the Americans turned to respond, the Germans were already climbing back to altitude, untouchable. By November 1942, American bomber crews flying missions over Tunisia were taking casualties that commanders described in classified reports as unsustainable. Without effective fighter escort, B-26 Marauder formations approaching German supply depots near Tunis and Bizerte were being torn apart. Experienced crews who had survived a dozen missions were dying on Mission 13. Morale was eroding. Something had to change, and it had to change immediately. The problem was not lack of courage. American pilots in their P-40s flew into situations they knew were potentially fatal and flew them anyway. The problem was physics. The laws of aerodynamics and thermodynamics do not care about courage. Above 20,000 feet, a P-40 was running out of air to breathe figuratively and literally. Its engine struggled. Its speed dropped. The 109s above it did not have this problem. Not yet. It was into this desperate tactical situation that a very unusual aircraft arrived. It had been sitting in development since 1937, born from a specification that engineers at almost every major American aircraft company had read, shaken their heads at, and quietly declined to take seriously. The Army Air Corps wanted a high-altitude interceptor that could reach 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, sustain 360 miles per hour at altitude, and carry enough armament to destroy heavy bombers in a single pass. No single engine design available in 1937 could meet those requirements. The engines of the era simply did not produce enough power. Lockheed's chief engineer, Clarence Kelly Johnson, looked at the specification for a long time. He was 27 years old. He had graduated from the University of Michigan with degrees in aeronautical engineering and had joined Lockheed 3 years earlier. He had a reputation for finding solutions that other engineers dismissed before they finished drawing them on paper. Johnson's solution was radical. Instead of a conventional fuselage, he would mount each engine in its own separate boom extending backward from the wing. The pilot would sit in a central nacelle between the two booms. The tail surfaces would connect the booms at the rear, giving the aircraft its distinctive twin-tail appearance. Each boom would contain an Allison V1 710 12-cylinder liquid-cooled engine producing 1,000 horsepower. Each engine would drive its own propeller, and those propellers would rotate in opposite directions. When Johnson presented this design to Lockheed management, the reaction was skepticism of the highest order. Twin-engine fighters were considered too heavy to be competitive in air-to-air combat. The conventional wisdom, backed by years of combat data from Europe, was that a twin-engine aircraft would always be at a disadvantage against a nimble single-engine fighter in a turning engagement. Experienced voices told Johnson his aircraft would be too slow in turns, too complex to maintain, too expensive to produce, and too difficult to fly in combat after engine damage. Johnson had answers for all of it. The counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque, the rotational force that made single-engine fighters pull hard in one direction during takeoff and aggressive maneuvering. Eliminating torque meant the aircraft was more stable, easier to control at all speeds, and more accurate as a gun platform. All 5 weapons, 120mm Hispano cannon and 4 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, were mounted in the nose of the central nacelle. They all pointed in exactly the same direction. There was no convergence calculation, no range where the bullet streams crossed. Where the nose aimed, every bullet and every shell went. At 300 yards, a 2-second burst delivered over 20 pounds of metal. A single 20mm high-explosive round hitting an aluminum-skinned fighter was frequently all that was required. But the real secret weapon was not the guns or the airframe. It was something buried inside each engine boom. A General Electric turbo-supercharger. And this is where Johnson's design departed from everything that came before it in ways that would only become clear 20,000 feet above the Tunisian desert years later. Most fighters in 1942 used mechanically driven superchargers, a pump geared directly to the engine crankshaft that compressed incoming air to maintain engine power as altitude increased. These systems worked well near their designed altitude, but fell off sharply above it. The Bf-109 supercharger was optimized for 18,000 to 20,000 feet. Above that ceiling, power dropped fast. At 25,000 feet, a 109 pilot was nursing an engine that was gasping. Johnson's turbo-supercharger worked on a completely different principle. It used the engine's own exhaust gases to spin a turbine wheel at thousands of revolutions per minute. That turbine compressed incoming air and forced it into the engine intake at pressures the mechanically driven systems could not maintain at high altitude. More importantly, the system was self-regulating. As the aircraft climbed and the air thinned, exhaust pressure remained relatively stable, keeping the turbine spinning and the engine producing power. At 30,000 feet, where a Bf-109 was barely maintaining 200 miles per hour, and its pilot was fighting just to keep the engine running. A P-38. Lightning was cruising at over 300 miles per hour with power reserves remaining for combat maneuvering. This was not a marginal advantage. This was a fundamental shift in the physics of high-altitude air combat. And no German pilot alive in November 1942 understood what was about to hit them. The first P-38 units arrived in North Africa in late November and early December of 1942. They came with problems. The complex turbo systems sometimes failed. Sand-infiltrated engine cowlings. Cockpit heaters proved inadequate for the -40-degree temperatures at combat altitude. Pilots flew their first missions in electrically heated suits borrowed from bomber crews, their breath fogging their canopies, their hands barely functional on the controls. On December 5, 1942, 4 P-38s took off from a primitive airstrip in Algeria to escort a formation of B-26 Marauder medium bombers attacking a German supply depot near Tunis. The Lightning pilots climbed to 22,000 feet. The bombers flew below them. German radar tracked the formation from the coast. Luftwaffe controllers scrambled 12 Bf-109s from airfields near Bizerte. The German flight leader briefed that American escorts would-be P-40s spotted the strange twin-boom aircraft and hesitated for only a moment before dismissing them. They looked like reconnaissance aircraft, possibly a new type of light bomber, not a threat. He rolled into his dive building speed, targeting the lead bomber, executing the same attack geometry that had worked 100 times before. The P-38 flight leader, a first lieutenant from California with fewer than 400 total flying hours, pushed his throttles to the stops and dove to intercept. What happened in the next 8 minutes sent shockwaves through every Luftwaffe intelligence report filed in the following weeks. The German pilot who had rolled into that dive would land at his base that afternoon, unable to stop his hands from trembling. He would tell his debrief officer something that the officer would initially refuse to write in the official record, because it seemed like the product of combat stress rather than observed fact. He said the American twin-engine fighter had followed him through a diving attack, stayed with him through a climbing turn, chased him to 28,000 feet, where his engine was struggling to maintain altitude, and had only broken off the engagement when the American pilot chose to break off. Not because the German had escaped, because the American had let him go. In Part 2, we're going to see what happened when the Germans finally understood what they were facing, how they tried to adapt, and why their best counter-tactics led directly to one of the most one-sided aerial massacres in the entire history of the war. Over 50 German aircraft destroyed in under 30 minutes. The event American pilots called the Palm Sunday Massacre, and the forked-tailed devil that made it possible. In Part 1, we watched a German pilot land at his base near Tripoli with shaking hands and a story his debrief officer refused to believe. A twin-engine American fighter had followed him through every defensive maneuver he knew. Climbing, diving, turning. Nothing worked. The P-38 Lightning had arrived in North Africa, and the Luftwaffe had no idea what it was facing. But here is the number nobody talks about when they tell this story. In the first 3 weeks of December 1942, American commanders received 17 separate combat reports describing P-38 performance that exceeded every projection in every training manual. 17 reports. And the response from senior officers in Washington was not enthusiasm. It was suspicion. It was committees. It was the institutional machinery of a military bureaucracy confronting evidence that challenged everything it had spent years believing about twin-engine fighter aircraft. And this is where the story gets darker before it gets better. Brigadier General John Cannon, commanding the 12th Fighter Command in North Africa, was not a man who doubted casually. He had 20 years of military aviation behind him. He had read every performance report on the P-40, the P-39, and the early P-38 deployments. His conclusion, shared by several senior officers in both North Africa and Washington, was straightforward and delivered without apology. The P-38 was too complex, too maintenance-intensive, too demanding for pilots with limited combat experience. The early operational reports showing impressive performance were in his assessment statistical noise from a handful of engagements that did not represent sustained combat capability. What mattered was sortie rate. What mattered was availability percentage. What mattered was how many aircraft could be put in the air on any given morning, and on that metric, the P-38, with its dual turbo-supercharger systems, its Allison engines sensitive to sand and cold, its demanding maintenance schedule was performing at roughly 58% availability, compared to 71% for the P-40 units it was supposed to replace. Colonel Troy Keith, commanding the 1st Fighter Group flying P-38s out of Aix-les-Bains in Algeria, sat across from Cannon in a command tent on December 19, 1942. And listened to this analysis with the controlled expression of a man choosing very carefully which battle to fight. General Keith said, "I can give you a 71% availability rate on a P-40 that cannot follow a 109 above 20,000 feet. Or, I can give you a 58% availability rate on an aircraft that shot down 4 German fighters yesterday without losing a single pilot. Which number matters more?" Cannon's response was not recorded in the official minutes of that meeting. What was recorded was his order. P-38 units would continue operations, but expansion of Lightning deployments would require a formal operational assessment submitted through proper channels, reviewed by staff in Washington, and approved before additional squadrons could be re-equipped. Proper channels. In December 1942, while German fighters were destroying American bomber formations over Tunisia, proper channels meant weeks, possibly months. Keith walked out of that tent knowing he had one card left to play, and he drove 3 hours through the Algerian desert to find the man he needed to play it. Lieutenant Colonel Chet Sluter had been flying fighters since 1936. He had studied the Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine more carefully than almost any other American officer in the theater, corresponding with British pilots, who had fought over France and Britain, building a personal analytical framework for understanding German combat methods that went far beyond anything in the official training manuals. More importantly, Sluter had the ear of General Karl Spaatz, the senior American air commander in the theater, in a way that bypassed the normal chain of hierarchy, because Spaatz trusted Sluter's assessments in the specific way senior commanders sometimes trust subordinates who have proven right when everyone else was wrong. Sluter read Keith's combat reports in one sitting. He looked up and said 4 words. "When can we demonstrate?" The demonstration was scheduled for January 3, 1943. The conditions Cannon's staff imposed were deliberately stringent. 2 P-38s against 2 of the theater's most experienced P-40 pilots in a series of simulated combat engagements at altitudes ranging from 15,000 to 28,000 feet. The P-40 pilots would be given altitude advantage for half the engagements. Performance would be judged on energy retention, climbing rate, simulated gunnery position acquisition, and sustained speed at altitude. 3 senior staff officers would observe and score. If the P-38 failed to demonstrate clear superiority across the full altitude range, Keith's request for expanded deployment would be denied for a minimum of 60 days. The morning of January 3rd was cold and clear over the airfield at Tebessa. A small group of officers stood beside a canvas shelter watching ground crews finish their pre-flight checks. The P-40 pilots were Major William Leverett and Captain James Butler, both with over 150 combat hours in type. They were confident. They knew every characteristic of the 109s they had been fighting for months. They knew how to push their Warhawks to their absolute limits. And they knew in the way experienced pilots know things that a heavier twin-engine aircraft was going to have specific predictable weaknesses that a skilled opponent could exploit. At 10:14 a.m., all 4 aircraft climbed away from the field and headed northeast toward the exercise area over the desert. The first 3 engagements conducted between 15,000 and 18,000 feet were competitive. Leverett's P-40 turned inside the Lightning twice, achieving simulated firing position both times. The observers noted this with the quiet satisfaction of men whose existing beliefs were being confirmed. At lower altitudes on the 109's home turf, the P-38 could be beaten. This was exactly what the doctrine predicted. Then the altitude changed. At 22,000 feet, something shifted. The P-40s began laboring. Their engines designed for lower altitude optimization were pulling hard to maintain speed through turns. The P-38s were not laboring. The turbo-superchargers were doing exactly what Kelly Johnson had designed them to do, feeding compressed air into engines that responded with power no mechanically supercharged aircraft could match at this altitude. The Lightning pilots were not fighting their aircraft anymore. They were simply flying it smoothly with authority, while the P-40 pilots below them worked harder and harder for diminishing returns. By 25,000 feet, the engagement was not competitive. It was a demonstration. The P-38s climbed away from every pursuit attempt. They dove accelerated and converted that speed back into altitude in zoom climbs that left the P-40s flat-footed. When Leverett tried his most aggressive defensive maneuver, a hard-rolling reversal designed to force an overshoot, the Lightning pilot anticipated, it throttled back fractionally and settled into a textbook firing position within 11 seconds. Colonel Keith, watching from an observation aircraft at 19,000 feet, counted those 11 seconds on his watch. At 28,000 feet, Leverett leveled his P-40 firewall throttle and simply flew straight. The Lightning pulled alongside him, matched his speed effortlessly, then accelerated past him and was 400 yards ahead before Leverett could process what he was seeing. Butler, the second P-40 pilot, descended to 20,000 feet and tried to draw the second P-38 into a low-altitude turning fight. The Lightning pilot refused. He stayed high-circled once and then dove with enough accumulated speed to achieve a simulated gun solution before Butler could complete a single defensive turn. The debrief lasted 40 minutes. Major Leverett spoke first. He said that above 22,000 feet, he had no answer for the P-38. None. He recommended immediate expanded deployment. It was not what anyone had expected to hear from the man who had beaten the Lightning twice at lower altitude. But Leverett was a combat pilot, not a politician. And what he had felt above 22,000 feet, the sensation of his aircraft running out of sky, while the Lightning had sky to spare, was not something he could rationalize away for the benefit of institutional convenience. General Cannon approved the expansion request 4 days later. P-38 production at Lockheed's Burbank facility was already running at over 100 aircraft per month. Additional units in North Africa would be re-equipped through February and March. Pilot training would be accelerated with emphasis on a single tactical principle that every briefing now repeated like a command: altitude is everything. Above 20,000 feet, the Lightning owned the sky. Below 15,000 feet, it was vulnerable. The pilot's job was to ensure every engagement happened on the right side of that line. The Germans noticed the change within weeks. Luftwaffe after-action reports from January 1943 began describing American fighter escorts that refused to descend when 109s tried to draw them down. P-38 pilots, who 2 months earlier had sometimes made the mistake of following German fighters into low-altitude turning fights, were now holding altitude with a discipline that suggested they had learned something important at a cost their predecessors had paid in full. By February 1943, the operational tempo was accelerating on both sides. American bomber formations were penetrating deeper into German-held territory with measurably lower attrition. German fighter units were receiving internal communications that used language never before seen in Luftwaffe tactical doctrine: avoid prolonged engagement with twin-engine American fighters above 20,000 feet. Break off. Disengage. The aircraft that had been dismissed as a heavy, slow twin-engine compromise was now generating official avoidance orders from the most experienced fighter force in the world. But here is what the Americans did not yet understand in February 1943. The Germans were adapting faster than anyone anticipated. Luftwaffe intelligence had obtained partial technical specifications for the P-38's turbo-supercharger system. German engineers were already analyzing its vulnerabilities. Its intercooler system, the component that cooled compressed air before it entered the engine, was a single point of failure. One well-placed round could rupture it, causing the engine to detonate from heat within seconds. German pilots were being briefed on exactly where to aim. And on April 5, 1943, a Luftwaffe unit over the Gulf of Tunis would use this knowledge to destroy 3 P-38s in under 2 minutes, creating a crisis of confidence that threatened to unravel everything the Lightning program had built. The tactics that had been winning the war in the air were suddenly catastrophically exposed. And the Americans had 13 days to find an answer before the largest aerial convoy in the history of the North African campaign would fly directly into the middle of it. The real war was just beginning. 2 parts ago, Kelly Johnson drew an aircraft that experts called unbuildable. 1 part ago, Colonel Keith sat in a command tent and convinced a skeptical general to give the P-38 one formal demonstration at altitude. The demonstration worked. Deployment expanded. And on April 5, 1943, Luftwaffe pilots over the Gulf of Tunis used newly acquired intelligence about the Lightning's intercooler vulnerability to destroy 3 P-38s in under 2 minutes. The Americans had 13 days before the largest aerial evacuation convoy in North African history would fly directly into that same kill zone. 13 days to solve a problem that German engineers had spent 3 months engineering specifically to end the P-38's dominance. And now, this was no longer a test. This was survival. German Luftwaffe intelligence chief, Colonel Josef Schmid, did not panic when his analysts presented the full technical breakdown of the P-38's turbo-supercharger system in late February 1943. He read the report carefully, asked 3 questions, received 3 satisfactory answers, and then issued a directive that circulated through every fighter unit in the Mediterranean theater within 72 hours. The directive identified 2 specific vulnerabilities. First, the intercooler radiators mounted in the leading edges of the P-38's outer wing sections were largely unarmored and could be ruptured by a single 20mm cannon hit, causing catastrophic engine failure from heat within seconds of impact. Second, the aircraft's wide turning radius at lower altitudes created a predictable defensive pattern that an aggressive attacker could exploit if he could force the engagement below 18,000 feet. Schmid's pilots began training against these specific parameters immediately. They practiced diving attacks from high angles, targeting the outer wing sections. They practiced coordinated 2-on-1 attacks designed to force a Lightning pilot into a descending turn. They flew mock engagements against twin-engine aircraft to understand the visual tracking problems involved in targeting the intercooler location precisely from a moving platform at closing speeds above 400 miles per hour. By March 1943, Luftwaffe after-action reports showed the results. German pilots who executed the intercooler attack correctly were achieving P-38 kills at a rate that alarmed American intelligence. 14 P-38s were lost in a 3-week period compared to 6 in the entire month of January. The kill ratio that had been running heavily in the Americans' favor began tightening. More concerning, 3 of the 14 losses occurred during escort missions, where the bombers were left unprotected at the moment of engagement, resulting in bomber losses that partially offset the operational gains the Lightning program had produced. Colonel Keith received the loss statistics on March 28th. He sat with them for a long time. He was looking at evidence that the Germans had done what the Germans always did when confronted with a new problem. They analyzed it, identified the specific mechanism of its success, and engineered a precise counter. The P-38 was not beaten, but it was no longer shocking the enemy into paralysis. It was now in a contest of adaptation, and adaptation favored the side with more combat experience. That was not the Americans, not yet. Then on April 5th, the worst day materialized. A flight of 6 P-38s from the 82nd Fighter Group was escorting B-17 over the Gulf of Tunis, when a coordinated staffel of 12 Bf-109Gs executed the new intercooler attack profile with textbook precision. 3 Lightnings went down in 90 seconds. The surviving pilots reported that the German attackers had come from above and slightly to the side, targeting the outer wing sections specifically and breaking away before the remaining P-38 pilots could respond. It was not a brawl. It was a surgical procedure. American bomber crews watched 3 aircraft they had come to depend on for their survival spiral into the Mediterranean in less than 2 minutes, trailing white vapor from ruptured cooling systems, and the psychological effect on everyone who witnessed it was immediate and severe. 48 hours later, Keith was in a meeting with 3 other officers, arguing about whether the P-38 escort profile needed to be fundamentally redesigned. One officer suggested abandoning high-altitude positioning in favor of close escort at bomber altitude. Keith said that surrendered the one advantage the Lightning had over the 109. Another officer suggested flying the P-38S in larger formations to create overlapping defensive coverage. Keith said that reduced the number of escort aircraft available per bomber formation. The argument went in circles for 2 hours and ended with no decision, which was itself a decision. Continue current operations while the analysis continued. On April 14th, 9 days after the losses over the Gulf of Tunis, Captain John Tilley of the 1st Fighter Group walked into Keith's command post and put a 2-page handwritten tactical note on the desk. Tilley had been flying P-38s since December. He had 17 combat missions and 3 confirmed kills. He was 24 years old. His note described a modification to the escort positioning protocol that addressed the intercooler vulnerability by using the second aircraft in each pair as a dedicated high cover specifically positioned to observe and engage any attacker targeting the first aircraft's outer wing sections. The protocol required the pair to fly a slightly wider separation than standard doctrine, approximately 400 yards, rather than the usual 200, with the high cover aircraft positioned 2,000 feet above and 30 degrees off the lead aircraft's tail. Any attacker committing to the intercooler approach angle would spend at least 8 seconds in a predictable flight path observable from the high cover position. 8 seconds was enough time. Keith read the note once, looked up and said, "Can you demonstrate this Thursday, April 18, 1943, 14:20 hours local time? The sky above the Sicilian Channel between Cape Bon and the island of Sicily is clear visibility. Unlimited temperature, minus 22 degrees Celsius at 8,000 feet. A formation of approximately 90 German transport aircraft is crossing the channel at low altitude. Junkers, Ju-52s, and the massive Messerschmitt Me-3, 23 6-engine transports laden with fuel ammunition, and 2,000 German soldiers attempting to escape the collapsing Tunisian perimeter. Their fighter escort is a mixed force of Bf-109s and Macchi C-202s, 50 fighters, total flying cover above the lumbering transports. American radar tracks them. The call goes out. Every available fighter in range is scrambled. P-38s from the 1st and 82nd Fighter Groups, P-40, Spitfires. They converge from 3 directions. The German escort pilots see them coming. They have numbers and they have position. What they do not have is enough fighters to protect 90 slow transports against over 70 attacking aircraft simultaneously. They try. German and Italian fighter pilots throw themselves into the intercept with genuine courage, knowing that the transports behind them are carrying living men. Several 109 pilots make multiple attacking passes into the Allied formations, accepting hits to disrupt the attack runs. It is not enough. The P-38S hit the transport formation from above and slightly ahead, exactly the attack geometry. Tilley's protocol specified for the escort role, now inverted for pure offensive use. The concentrated nose armament does what it was designed to do. A single 2-second burst from 120mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns delivers over 20 pounds of metal. Against the thin aluminum skin of a Ju-52 transport carrying aviation fuel, this is catastrophic. The first aircraft hit disintegrates, literally. Wing separating from fuselage at the root, both pieces continuing forward on separate trajectories for half a second before gravity takes them. The second aircraft takes a burst through the starboard engine and the forward fuel tank simultaneously. It does not explode immediately. It flies for 4 more seconds burning, and then it does. Guns. Fire. Impact. Debris. The Mi-323s are worse. 6 engines and enormous size make them appear invulnerable, but their size means more surface area for bullets to find critical systems. A burst through the wing root severs fuel lines feeding 3 engines on one side. The aircraft yaws violently, rolls, and impacts the water at 180 miles per hour. German escort pilots fight desperately to intervene. 2 Bf-109 pilots manage to position for attacks on P-38S and score hits. 1 Lightning goes down, trailing smoke. The 109s themselves are engaged by the P-40 and Spitfire elements, who have specifically positioned to neutralize the escort, while the Lightnings work the transports. This is coordinated. This is planned. This is 3 months of tactical evolution executing simultaneously in the space of 26 minutes. When it ends, 58 German transport aircraft have been destroyed, or so severely damaged they crash before reaching Sicily. The 2,000 soldiers aboard them are dead or in the water. German fighter losses in the escort engagement total 11 aircraft. Allied losses are 6. The channel is marked with debris oil slicks and life rafts for a 40-mile stretch. Surviving German transports, roughly 30 of them, turn back toward Tunisia, or make emergency landings on beaches, having watched 2/3 of their formation cease to exist around them. American pilots call it the Palm Sunday Massacre. The name sticks immediately because it is accurate. Pilots who participated file after-action reports using language that is professionally measured but cannot entirely conceal the emotional weight of what they witnessed. Captain Tilley writes in his report, "The engagement demonstrated that coordinated multi-type attack against escorted transport formations produces results that single-type operations cannot achieve." This is correct. It is also the most restrained possible description of 58 aircraft falling into the sea in less than half an hour. German Luftwaffe Command receives the loss report that evening. The response at high levels is not tactical. It is strategic. General Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the Mediterranean, reviews the numbers and issues a recommendation to Berlin. The following morning, large-scale air evacuation of Tunisia is no longer viable. Ground forces must attempt evacuation by sea, using small vessels, or must be prepared for the possibility that evacuation is not possible. 3 weeks later, 250,000 German and Italian troops surrender in Tunisia. It is the largest Axis capitulation in the war to that point. The air corridor that should have allowed organized withdrawal has been closed. The P-38s did not do this alone. P-40 Spitfires and naval forces all contributed. But the Lightning's unique combination of altitude performance range and concentrated firepower had been the instrument that forced the Germans into the specific tactical choices that led to April 18th. Without the Lightning establishing dominance above 20,000 feet, German fighters could have maintained the escort altitudes that protected their transports. Without the Lightning's range attacks on the convoy routes could not have been sustained consistently. Without the concentrated nose armament, individual attack passes would have been less lethal per trigger pull, giving transports more chances to survive damaged. By the end of May 1943, American pilots flying P-38s in the Mediterranean theater had recorded 235 confirmed aerial victories since December, with a loss ratio of approximately 7-to-1 in the Lightning's favor. Bomber loss rates on escorted missions had fallen from 8.3% per mission in November 1942 to 2.1% in May 1943. German fighter units that had entered the campaign with experienced veterans averaging 150 combat missions had been ground down to a force led increasingly by pilots with fewer than 40 missions. Replacement pilots arrived in Sicily and Italy carrying the tactical warnings that now circulated through every Luftwaffe briefing: avoid sustained engagement with the fork-tailed aircraft above 20,000 feet. The fork-tailed Devil had delivered its verdict over the Sicilian Channel on April 18th, and the verdict was final. The age of German air superiority in the Mediterranean was over. But here is the question that historians have asked for 80 years, and that most accounts of the P-38 story never fully answer. What happened to the men who built this moment? What happened to Kelly Johnson, who drew an aircraft on paper that experts said was impossible? What happened to the young pilots who paid with their lives, learning how to fly it correctly? What happened to the German veterans who adapted, survived, and carried the memory of the fork-tailed Devil into old age? And what does the P-38 story actually mean for how we build weapons, train soldiers, and make decisions under pressure in the middle of a war we might be losing? In Part 4, we close the story. And the final chapter is the one that nobody expected. From a 27-year-old engineer's sketch of an aircraft that had no fuselage to 235 confirmed aerial victories and the collapse of German air superiority over North Africa. From a design that senior officers called unbuildable to a machine that German pilots named the fork-tailed Devil and actively feared. From December 1942 to May 1943, the P-38 Lightning compressed years of technological advantage into 6 months of combat that changed the direction of the Mediterranean War. But here is the question that 3 parts of this story have been building toward. What happened to the men who made it possible? Because success in wartime does not always look the way we expect it to look. And sometimes the most important part of a story is the part that happens after the cameras stop rolling. Clarence Kelly Johnson returned to Lockheed's Burbank facility in 1943 with a reputation that had been transformed by combat reports he had never expected to read in his lifetime. The aircraft he had designed on the edge of professional ridicule was now the subject of urgent production meetings, congressional interest, and requests from every theater commander who had heard what happened over the Sicilian Channel on April 18th. Johnson was 33 years old. He had been right when the institution told him he was wrong, and the institution now wanted more of whatever he had been doing. He gave them more. Over the following decades, Johnson's design philosophy, which he codified into a set of 14 rules for managing advanced development projects, became the foundation of what Lockheed called the Skunk Works. Working in a small, isolated team with minimal bureaucratic oversight, direct access to decision-makers, and freedom to pursue unconventional solutions. Johnson and his team produced the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, the SR-71 Blackbird, and the F-117 stealth fighter. These were not incremental improvements on existing designs. They were generational leaps, each one as unconventional in its era as the P-38 had been in 1937. The man who had been told his twin-boom design was suicidal went on to build the aircraft that flew faster, higher, and more invisibly than anything that came before it. Johnson received the Collier Trophy, America's highest aviation honor, twice. He received the Medal of Freedom. He was inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame. When he died in 1990, the obituaries described him as the greatest aircraft designer of the 20th century. He had started as a draftsman's apprentice. He had argued with generals. He had been right when the consensus was wrong repeatedly across 50 years of designing aircraft that changed what human beings believed was possible. But Johnson's story, as remarkable as it is not the one that stays with you longest when you sit with the history of the P-38. The story that stays is simpler and harder. The pilots who flew the Lightning in those first dangerous months of December 1942 and January 1943, when the tactics were still being written in real time, and the price of a wrong decision was measured in seconds, left behind records that are worth reading slowly. Of the first 4 P-38 pilots who flew that escort mission on December 5, 1942, the day the German debrief officer refused to believe his pilot's account, 2 survived the war. One was shot down over Italy in 1944 and spent 11 months as a prisoner. One completed his combat tour, returned to the United States, taught advanced fighter tactics in California, and died in a training accident in 1945, 3 months before Germany surrendered. He never knew the war ended. He never knew that the tactics he had helped develop and teach had become standard doctrine across the entire USAAF fighter force. The German pilot who had landed at Tripoli with shaking hands on November 23, 1942. The man whose encounter with the P-38 opens this entire story flew 312 combat missions before the war ended. He was shot down 4 times. He was wounded twice. He survived. In 1973, at an air show in California, he met the American pilot who had chased him across the Tunisian desert 3 decades earlier. They talked for 4 hours. The German pilot said later that it was the most useful conversation about air combat he had ever had, because they were the only 2 people on Earth who shared the specific memory of those 8 minutes above the desert in November 1942 from opposite ends of the gun sight. That meeting, 2 old men comparing memories of a morning that had shaped both their lives without either of them fully understanding how is as close as history gets to a complete sentence. The turbo-supercharger that gave the P-38 its altitude advantage did not stay in military aircraft. The principle behind it using exhaust energy to compress intake air and maintain engine performance across a wide range of operating conditions migrated into commercial aviation, automotive engineering, and industrial power generation across the post-war decades. Every turbocharged engine in the world today, in passenger cars, commercial aircraft diesel locomotives, and power plant generators, operates on a thermodynamic principle that General Electric engineers refined specifically for the P-38 program between 1937 and 1942. The scale of that inheritance is genuinely difficult to measure, but one estimate places the number of turbocharged internal combustion engines currently operating worldwide at over 500 million. 500 million machines breathing compressed air because a team of engineers needed to keep a fighter aircraft's engines running at 30,000 feet over North Africa. The P-38 itself remained in service through 1945, eventually being supplemented in Europe by the P-51 Mustang, which had longer range and was better suited to the specific demands of escorting heavy bombers deep into Germany. But in the Pacific, where the distances were enormous and the altitude requirements different, the Lightning continued to excel. Richard Bong, who flew P-38s in the Pacific and became America's highest-scoring ace, with 40 confirmed victories, credited the aircraft's range and its twin-engine reliability as the factors that brought him home from missions that would have been fatal in a single-engine fighter. Thomas Maguire, second on the American ace list with 38 victories, said the same. The 2 highest-scoring American pilots in the entire war both flew the aircraft that generals in 1937 had called too complex and too heavy to be competitive. The total operational record of the P-38 across all theaters from 1942 to 1945 includes approximately 1,800 confirmed aerial victories. It flew in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Germany, the Pacific Islands, New Guinea, the Philippines, and over the Japanese home islands. It served in photo reconnaissance variants that provided intelligence crucial to the planning of the Normandy invasion and the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific. It served as a ground attack platform that destroyed hundreds of supply convoys, rail yards, and fuel depots. And, in its escort role, the role it was born to fill over Tunisia. In December 1942, it contributed directly to the survival of bomber crews, whose mortality rate without effective escort had been approaching unsurvivable levels. The bravest thing about the P-38 story is not the Palm Sunday massacre, as spectacular as that engagement was. The bravest thing is December 5, 1942. A first lieutenant from California, with fewer than 400 total flying hours, sitting in an aircraft that had been in service for 3 weeks, with maintenance crews still learning how to keep its turbo-superchargers running in desert sand, making the split-second decision to push his throttles forward and intercept 12 Bf-109s, rather than staying in the safe defensive position above the bombers. He did not know for certain that his aircraft could do what he was about to ask it to do. He had been told it could. He had flown it in training. But he had never asked it to perform in combat against the best fighter pilots in the world. He asked it anyway. This is the pattern that repeats across the entire history of military innovation, and it is worth naming clearly because it is easy to tell these stories as if the technology were the protagonist. The technology is never the protagonist. Kelly Johnson's design existed on paper for 5 years before it changed the outcome of anything. The turbo-supercharger had been available since the 1930s. The concentrated nose armament was a straightforward engineering choice. None of it mattered until a pilot with less than a year of total flying experience made a decision under pressure and discovered that the machine underneath him was equal to the moment. Institutions resist innovation, not because they are populated by stupid people, but because institutions are designed to preserve what has worked before. General Cannon's skepticism about the P-38's maintenance demands was not irrational. It was based on real data and genuine experience. The problem was that his framework for evaluating the data did not include a variable for what happens when an aircraft can do something at 28,000 feet that no other aircraft in the theater can do at any altitude. New capabilities require new frameworks, and new frameworks require someone willing to argue for them before the data is complete. Colonel Keith argued. Captain Tilley wrote a 2-page note by hand and put it on a desk. Kelly Johnson drew an aircraft with no fuselage and told his managers he could build it. These are not dramatic gestures. They are ordinary acts of professional courage, the kind that happen in organizations every day, and are usually forgotten because they do not precede a war that history decides to remember. Here is the detail that most accounts of the P-38 story omit, and it changes the texture of everything that came before it. In 1973, when the German pilot who had fled into the cloud bank over Tunisia on November 23, 1942, sat down with the American pilot who had chased him, the American brought a photograph. It was a ground-level image of a P-38 taken at a forward airbase in Algeria, probably late 1942, judging by the markings. 3 mechanics were working on the port engine, their backs to the camera. The American had carried this photograph for 30 years, not because of the aircraft in it, but because of the men working on it. He did not know their names. He had never met them. But he knew that on the morning of December 5, 1942, when he pushed his throttles forward and went after 12 German fighters, the engine that responded was running because 3 men whose names he never learned had worked through a cold North African night to make it ready. He had been trying to find out who they were for 30 years. He never did. From a 27-year-old engineer's unconventional sketch to 235 aerial victories to the surrender of 250,000 Axis troops to 500 million turbocharged engines turning in machines across the modern world. The P-38 Lightning proved that the most dangerous thing an institution can do is tell someone with a good idea that their idea is impossible. Kelly Johnson proved that unconventional thinking pursued with discipline and defended with evidence can change the course of a war. The pilots who flew the Lightning proved that the best technology in the world is only as good as the human being willing to trust it under pressure. And 3 mechanics whose names history never recorded proved something quieter and equally true, that the people who make the extraordinary possible are often the ones nobody thinks to photograph from the front. If you have a story about an innovation that almost didn't happen, or a person whose contribution history forgot, share it in the comments. And subscribe if you want to keep finding the parts of history that the official record left out. Because there are hundreds more stories like this one. And every single one of them started with someone saying something the institution called insane.